Well, welcome everyone, and thanks for joining us tonight at the Aero Club's annual meeting. I'm Georgia Pappis, currently serving as co-president, along with Dan Schrager, and you will be hearing from Dan a little later in the meeting. I guess I don't have to remind you all but we have not had an in-person meeting for over a year. Although this is not our first virtual meeting, it is the first virtual annual meeting. And it will be a little bit different than previous years. Our goal is to condense the business meeting so we can continue with the award presentations and get to Paul Diette's outstanding presentation, flying in the UK. I will present the annual report and Dave Graham will present the awards. Then Paul will take over with his program. So we'll start with the treasurer's report. The good news is the Aero Club's treasury is solvent through this very difficult COVID period. We have not had any in-person meetings, which has reduced our expenses, and we are communicating with members via the internet, and this has also reduced mailing expenses. The IRS filing has been completed with the assistance of John Godfrey and filed by our accounting firm Edelstein CPA. Special thank you to John Godfrey for taking care of all the treasurer's duties. We appreciate his continued dedication to the club. The next is the annual report. Excuse me. I conducted the annual report for the Aero Club and have reviewed the club's bank accounts. This includes the club's operating and scholarship bank accounts. I am pleased to report that everything is in order in both of these accounts. We currently will move on to the Board of Directors election. The election has been completed for 2021, and we have the following directors for the 2021-24 term. Thank you to Charlie Burris for coordinating the election process. The election results are as follows in alphabetical order. Dave Deneen. We want to welcome Dave, who is our new first-time director. David is currently employed at Gale Associates, which is an airport engineering and planning company. Many of you know Dave, as he has spent many years supporting aviation in the area as director of the Massachusetts Airport Managers Association, along with managing shoreline aviation at Marshfield and managing the airport at Mansfield. We welcome Dave to the Aero Club board. Continuing on with the directors, Dr. Gary Kearney. Gary has been a dedicated supporter of the Aero Club for many years and also is a past president. Keith Leonard. Keith is currently serving as secretary. David O'Leary. David is the editor of our newsletter, Logbook, and yours truly, Georgia Pappis. Thank you all for both previous years of support and also agreeing to continue for the next 3 years. In addition to the directors, Dan and I have appointed 2 new advisors to the club, and I believe you can see their bios on screen. Rick Kennan, who is Chief Operating Officer for Transport at Boston MedFlight, and Nick Motlog, who is a Delta Airlines captain and a former Air Force pilot, and he is also active in the Air National Guard. We welcome you both and look forward to your participation. And one thing I'd like to mention, there has been a change in our scholarship chair. Jeff Bauer is now coordinating the scholarship program. Mark Holsworth had to resign to spend more time with in his business. This is double duty for Jeff, as he had chaired the Scholarship Education Committee for many years previously. So thank you, Jeff, for taking on the responsibility again. Also, Jim Sullivan is coordinating the flyouts this season, again, or otherwise known as Meet the Bunch for lunch. So we look forward to some interesting places to visit, and they'll be coming very soon. This concludes the business portion of the meeting. I just want to say that Dan and I want to expressly thank all of our committee chairs for doing such a great job. We sincerely appreciate all the time and effort that is spent running this club. Thank you very much to all of you. Now, I want to introduce David Graham. David is currently Director Emeritus. David has been a member of the Aero Club for about 50 years and has served as president and has also served many, many years as secretary. Dave will tell you all about the awards for this year. David, it's all yours.
All right, Georgia, thank you ever so much. And good evening, everybody. Well, good late afternoon. I just want to spend a couple of seconds also welcoming David Deneen aboard. David and I go way back. In fact, David literally grew up in an airport environment. His father, his late father, was Donald Deneen, who was the airport manager at Taunton Municipal Airport. I think I licensed him as an airport manager when I was with the old Aeronautics Commission. Welcome aboard, Dave. It's a pleasure to have you with us. And we'll move on from there to the awards presentation. Just a brief word on that. The awards presentation came about many years ago. We do 2 awards each year, normally. These are not normal times. We do the Honored Member Award given to somebody who has really done truly outstanding service to the Aero Club of New England. And that individual is selected by the Education Committee, for whom a scholarship is named for a 1-year period of various amounts. And last year, we had no annual meeting last year, as Georgia has already said. Last year, the club, the Education Committee, selected Barry V. for Victor Otto as the recipient. Barry is a great contributor to the Aero Club and other organizations, Boston Hangar QB, to say the least. And so I visited him yesterday and acquired, the day before yesterday, and acquired the photos you see now. I actually gave him his plaque, and you can read it. I don't need to read it for you. But it's really an honor to present the 2020 Honored Member Award to Barry Otto. Also last year, we did the Presidential Award, and I say we did it, I'm using past tense. The Presidential Award for within the 6-state region is selected in December. We have a luncheon for the directors at the Union Club on Wright Brothers Day. And we didn't do it last year. So we did it the year before, I'm sorry, in 2019. And we selected the, I'm sorry, we did it 2020. We selected last year the Rhode Island Aviation Hall of Fame as last year's recipient. We actually did not do a meeting this year, a December meeting, so we didn't do, we've not made a selection, as you'll soon see, but we selected the Rhode Island Aviation Hall of Fame because of the tremendous amount of aviation history and recipients that have been selected by this august group, one of whom, by the way, is none other than Richard Evelyn Byrd Jr., Admiral Byrd, then Lieutenant Commander Byrd. We all know him as he was one of our early Cabinet Award recipients. Richard Byrd actually had a Rhode Island connection at Newport. And so their plaque is being presented to the Rhode Island Aviation Hall of Fame, and I will try to personally deliver it. The founding father of the Rhode Island Hall of Fame, Aviation Hall of Fame, is none other than Frank Lennon. And Frank and his secretary, Bill Sheridan, are with us this evening, and they've asked if they could say a word or two. So I'm turning the mic over to Bill Sheridan and Frank Lennon. Go ahead.
Well, thank you very much. This is Frank Lennon, and on behalf of the Rhode Island Aviation Hall of Fame, I'm honored to accept this award from an organization as prestigious as the Aero Club of New England. And this is doubly sweet for us because we're all volunteers. I won't take up a lot of your time, but I do want to share with you something that we chuckle about every year as we present another group of awards. When we first announced our Hall of Fame in 2003, the reaction from skeptics to the idea was to snicker and say, well, this is Rhode Island. You'll run out of candidates in a few years. Little did these skeptics know just how rich and varied our aviation history is, and just how wonderfully skilled and talented contributors to the aerial age have been born in Rhode Island, were educated here, lived here for a portion of their lives, or performed some great aviation-related act or service here. And as David just mentioned, Byrd was the first head of the aviation section of the Rhode Island Naval Militia in 1916. And that's his major connection to Rhode Island. Anyway, each year's induction and the publicity it receives generates more recommendations from the general public. Many people have called to let us know. They'll call in and say, hey, did you know what my grandfather did? And lo and behold, we're off on another aviation adventure. Coming into this year, I mean, in addition to the 160 awards we've given over the past 17 years, we already have 7 complete packages, 126 new nominations in some form of preparation, and another 100 more awaiting initial documentation. Once again, the skeptics were wrong. We will not run out of deserving candidates for some time to come. And thank you once again, David and the Aero Club of New England for bringing attention to and recognizing our efforts.
Thank you, Frank, and I will be in contact with you to get the plaque to you. We're running short on time, so I want to jump over right now to my old pal, Jack Cryer. Jack, welcome aboard. You have been selected by the Education Committee this year to be the recipient of the Honored Member Award. I had a lot to say about you, but I'm going to can it for now because we are running short on time. And I'm going to turn the mic over to you, and that should take no more than a couple of minutes.
Well, David, I've had a little problem logging on today because I'm in a hotel in Sarasota and I'm using my laptop, but I can see your smiling face and I can also see mine now. So that is progress, but I want to extend my most heartfelt, sincere thanks to the Aero Club for awarding me this honor. It's been a great 30 years that I've been a member now. I have taken part in a lot of once-in-a-lifetime activities, like our 200 plane fly-ins at the Basin Harbor Club, like the great friends I've met, and of course, meeting David Graham is one of the high points. But I also want to say in closing that one of the highest points has been opening the scholarship application envelopes many years when I've done that, and finding such wonderful, wonderful young people coming out of the woodwork and writing good applications, good bios, and having no doubt gone on to great careers, partly due to the Aero Club's help. So thanks again. It's been a pleasure. It still is a pleasure.
Thank you, Jack. Deeply appreciate the kudos and for the club particularly. And we will be in contact with you to get you your plaque on your return back to Massachusetts. And so that is very briefly the awards presentation. Sorry it had to be so short, but we do have a great program coming up with Paul Diette, and I don't want to cut that short. And he's 5 hours ahead of us right now. So that's it, Georgia. Back to you. And Dan, thank you very much. And thank you for your 3 years of being our wonderful co-presidents.
Thank you, David. Thanks very much. So the final piece of this business meeting is bittersweet for both Georgia and myself, I'm sure. As you know, the Aero Club is run by a bunch of volunteers. There are 15 directors and a slate of 4 officers. And for the last 3 years, Georgia and I have served as co-presidents, which has been terrific because Georgia does all the work, and I sit here and I look at I look at a wonderful club. But all kidding aside, it's a lot of work, and it's been great to share it. It's the first time that structure has been in place, and it served us well through these very challenging times. But what I'd like to do at this point is to transition the presidency of the Aero Club to our successor, David Hampson. David is somebody who I've come to know. He approached me about 7 years ago, wanting to work with me in the aviation insurance business. And I thought, he's got to be nuts. You know, who wants to do what I do? But it's really a great business, and it's a great environment with all the aviators that we do come to meet, from Admiral Byrd up through Chuck Yeager and Harrison Ford and all the members of the club. But David is a passionate pilot. He has earned his commercial and instrument ratings in the time I've known him. He owns pieces of 3 airplanes that he's constantly flying, does all sorts of charity work and business work, and just loves to fly. And he's a very, very hard worker. So I think that he will be a terrific successor to both Georgia and me. David has served as the vice president of the Aero Club for the last several years. And under his tutelage, we've really developed a terrifically vibrant speakers program. David has he's gotten some fabulous presentations going. And with the challenges of video meetings, he's managed to really keep everybody engaged. But without further ado, I'd like to introduce the next president of our club, David Hampson. And I'd also like, one thing I did want to mention, David O'Leary, who was just recently elected, will be stepping in to take David's role as the vice president of the club. So the leadership of the Aero Club is in very capable hands. And I want to thank everybody who's made our jobs, both Georgia and my job, a pleasure. And to those that we're handing it off to, we're always here to back you up. So David, it's all yours.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Dan. I appreciate your kind words. I'm honored to have the opportunity to lead a club with such rich aviation history and such good people. In one of our recent board meetings, we were going around the virtual table, so to speak, so each director could introduce themselves to a new advisor. And during those intros, I was reminded of what an amazing and dedicated group of aviators we have managing the Aero Club. With the bench strength that people have supporting me, I'm excited about what we can collectively accomplish as we emerge from the pandemic. And I think we'll be able to combine the best of both worlds, reverting back to the in-person gatherings that make our social club social, while continuing to offer content virtually to a broader membership base that may include some members outside the greater Boston geographic area. And I want to provide some special thanks and recognition to Dan and Georgia. As Dan mentioned, they've served as co-presidents for the last 3 years, and this is both I should mention their second time serving as presidents of the club. They've both previously been president. And they graciously agreed to extend their co-presidency by a year when COVID hit last spring. And like most organizations, we had to pivot to restructure our club events and operations. They've been an amazing and wonderful team. Both have provided many years of dedicated service to the Aero Club, and they'll continue to be serving the Aero Club as valuable members of our board. As a token of appreciation on behalf of the Aero Club, I'd like to present this plaque and clock first to Georgia Pappis for her 3 years of service as our co-president of the Aero Club in New England and many years of service prior to that. So thank you very much, Georgia. We greatly appreciate it. And then we also have another award, also another beautiful clock plaque to present to Dan Schrager for his 3 years of service as our co-president and also many years of service before that. And I'm thankful that they're both continuing on in their capacity as board members, and I have their support and their wisdom to draw from as president. So thank you both, and thank you to David Graham for helping organize the beautiful plaques and clocks.
Thank you very much, David. It's greatly appreciated. And as I've said, and you know, we're here to back you up.
Well, I appreciate that. And we've got, as I mentioned, we have a great team of people, which is going to make, you know, leading the organization, you know, so much easier with the support and the knowledge.
Yes, thank you. Thank you all. This is Georgia, if you can't see me. Thank you all. I appreciate that. And I do want you to notice that both of the clocks have stopped at the same time.
We had to work really hard to make that happen. So yeah.
Yeah.
Well, next we're going to transition into our to our presentation by Paul Diette. So I'm going to just provide a brief introduction to Paul for those of you who don't know him. And Paul is going to show us what it's like flying in England. I've known Paul for a number of years. He's been a longtime Aero Club member and volunteer who moved to England several years ago, and he brought a Cessna 182 with him. Paul has an extensive aviation background, as you can see from his bio. He's flown as a private pilot, 41 years incident-free. He served in the U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary, and he's written articles for AOPA, and he chaired or co-chaired our signature crash course event for 20 years. I think Paul's presentation will be fascinating, and it may also give us a new appreciation for our FAA and the freedom of flight we're privileged to have here in the United States. And before I turn over to Paul, I just want to mention that if anyone has any questions, please type into the chat box, and we'll address it at the end. We'll have some time, a few minutes to address questions and answers. So just type in the chat box, and we'll address it at the end. So with that, I'll turn it over to Paul. Thank you, Paul.
Hey, everybody. Thanks. And I appreciate your taking the time to enjoy this presentation tonight. As mentioned in the introduction, I've lived here now for about 4.5 years and learned a lot about flying in the United Kingdom. Some of the things that I learned were delayed because I spent about 2 years suffering very badly at a music college in London, making great sounds with a lot of really cool young people and becoming a professional drummer and a music producer as well. When I had a chance to settle down and get back to my flying activities, I ended up eventually basing my aircraft, which you can see here in this photograph, at Goodwood Aerodrome, which is in a town called Chichester that's south of England and south of London. It's fairly close to the water along the English Channel. And as you can see, my airplane is that one that's been marked off in this little red box. I haven't yet had the opportunity to fly one of the many Spitfires that operates at this airfield and many others around the United Kingdom, but it's something I'm looking forward to doing. So the airfield that you saw in the graphic was originally formed as a fighter base for World War II, and it hosted the 309th U.S. Fighter Squadron. And there were several aces who flew for the United States Army Air Corps out of that location, and some of those are highlighted here. And so the airport still maintains a feeling from that era in many different ways that you'll see. So when you're flying in the UK, I will say that it's a very active vintage fleet. So you're going to see a lot of aircraft that are in almost showroom condition, and yet that they have all of the capabilities to work in contemporary airspace. There's a lot of lighter aircraft because the operating costs here are very high. in terms of fuel is about equivalent of $10 a gallon. They don't have any ADS-B network that's ground-based. The only ADS-B you get is going to be air-to-air from other ADS-B equipped aircraft, and there's no mandate for ADS-B right now. So in flight, you don't get the advantage of any traffic data, weather data, TFRs, and things like that. They don't have any kind of flight service station network that you can tap into. There's no en route weather data available to you while you're flying. There are 65 GNSS approaches in England, but most of those service airports that are there for the airlines to work with. There's very limited radar coverage, especially when you get to some of the busiest areas, surprisingly enough. They typically assign a single squawk code to everybody using an aerodrome so that the air traffic controllers may know that the airplanes they're looking at on their scope are associated with one particular aerodrome, but they don't know one aircraft from another in that scenario. And that can make things a little bit challenging. Anywhere that you want to go with your airplane, you have to get permission ahead of time. And you'll do that from the airport operator, either by a phone call, an email, or filling out a form online. And then you have to pay for everything that you do. So every landing gets charged at every airport anywhere in the country that you go to. You can buy discounts and get like 10 landings for $50, but usually you're looking about $15 to $20 equivalent for every landing. And they'll charge touch and goes as if they were landings. And then everything that they do in terms of the navigation, while supported by good apps, is also backed up by paper. There's a tremendous amount of paper involved in how you fly here in the United Kingdom. So in addition to being part of the Aero Club in New England, I'm also part of the Goodwood Aero Club. So we have a really excellent club at Goodwood. We have a variety of guest speakers that come in. The club's fortunate enough to be based in a brand new clubhouse that we built, about $5 million worth of structure there with a beautiful pilot's lounge and a cafe. And we park the aircraft right outside on the grass because it's a convenient place for the flight school aircraft to base, or any visiting aircraft that are worth showing off will drop by there as well. And then we do a lot of great trips. So one of the trips that we did was a tour of Heathrow, and it was a cook's tour that lasted about 7 hours. And we went through every inch of Heathrow, including a tower visit where I shot the photograph you see on the right side. And then in the basement of the tower complex, we visited the virtual control tower that's being developed, which is used for training, but it's also used as a technology demonstrator. They're going to eventually replace glass windows, if you want to call it that, with 4K cameras times about 50 that are going to give the tower controllers an excellent augmented reality view of everything that's going on in the airport, because with the types of weather that you can get in a coastal area, this will allow the controllers to be able to see through limited visibility to the aircraft as they are moving and arriving and departing. So that's pretty cool. And then certainly I think the most cool trip that we did as a group was we went to Salzburg, Austria, where we had a chance to spend a couple of days with the group from Red Bull and visit what they call the Flying Bulls. And then also got to tour an automotive exhibit that was part of the history in Salzburg. When you fly in the United Kingdom, you can use your FAA credentials because the FAA, the US is part of the ICAO. That so far hasn't been changed by Brexit. There's a very complex validation process you have to go through in submitting your papers and getting the local chief pilot of the flight school that you're affiliated with sign off on everything. And they also have to get copies of that person's logbooks and their medicals in addition to all of yours. You have to revalidate that annually. They don't have any recognition of US basic med, even though they have their own equivalent here. If you're flying on US credentials, you have to get a FAA Class 3 medical at a minimum, and you have to maintain all of your standard FAA currencies, BFRs, and things of that nature, or as they're called now, flight reviews. But you do retain all the privileges that you come over here with. So I'm instrument rated. And so as an American pilot, you know, we're used to flying at night and flying on instruments. In the UK, everything's graduated. You start day VFR only. So most people who learn to fly here never get the privilege to fly at night. let alone the privilege to do instrument work if you're a private flyer. Those are fairly rare things to do. And then there are fees that are charged by the Civil Aviation Authority, as well as fees that you might pay to any of the airports. So you pay for every landing, every touch and go. You pay for every approach. Even if you go missed, you pay for that approach, which really discourages people from practicing and keeping their skills up. How do you pay? Well, at some point you have to land and go to the fire station or to the equivalent of the FBO desk and pull out your credit card and pay on site. And then there's a list of expenses that are added to what you're doing by the Civil Aviation Authority. So if you wanted to have a flying display, similar to what we used to do up at Basin Harbor, the number of aircraft that you bring in there is going to drive a charge that's going to be paid to the Civil Aviation Authority to authorize what you're doing with that many airplanes. And it's very expensive. So it's hard to, just keep this in mind. This is what user fees look like. And if you let them show up in the United States, they will grow and you'll never get rid of them. So the other thing that's interesting here is the airfields. Every airfield's different, and I don't just mean in terms of how they're laid out. Every aerodrome has their own unique traffic pattern, and pretty much no two are alike. So what they have, as shown here on the right, is something called an overhead join as standard operating procedure. If you fly the entire overhead join as described here, it can take about 20 minutes to do. They do not have any overlapping frequencies because they're using the 8.33 kilohertz spacing, so that's beneficial. I know when I used to fly a lot in Eastern Massachusetts, you get up to pattern altitude and you hear, half a dozen different airports all throughout, Southern New Hampshire and Rhode Island and Massachusetts all at the same time. So that's a blessing. They use two different altimeter settings, which is, I think, unusual. Let's just say that. So their version of QNH yields an MSL altitude, but they also use what's called QFE, and that yields an AGL altitude. So if you set the altimeter setting for QFE when you're on the ground, your altimeter is going to read 0, which is something that you see aerobatic pilots doing all the time. And that creates a challenge if you go from one aerodrome to another, unless you can pick up the new QFE at the aerodrome that you're going to be going to. But in the middle, there's a discrepancy between which is the right, altimeter setting, if you want to call that. Noise abatement is a religion here. It's really important for everyone who flies here to do their utmost to avoid creating noise challenges for the airport, because the local communities have massive amounts of authority over what can happen at an airport. So there are airports that are quite limited by how many flying cycles they can allow per day. There are a lot of grass airfields here. Probably something on the order of 2/3 of all airfields you might operate out of here are grass-based. And so they can get quite waterlogged and muddy in the winter. Okay, so if you want to get weather data from the government, you have to subscribe and you have to pay a fee to access government-issued weather data beyond some sort of super basic stuff. So most people use third-party apps on their phone or tablet to be able to support their self-briefing requirements for weather. Now, here's an example of an airfield. This is called Compton and Bass. It's about a half an hour west of where I'm based, out of Goodwood. Grass strip kind of set up on a hill. Pretty straightforward, right? You'd think, but not really. It's a beautiful place, but you'd first do the PPR online. And then once you arrive, you're going to have a choice of lots of different augmentation flying experiences you can get involved with. And by the way, this year they're giving away a free private pilot's license to the lucky winner of a basically an essay contest. But before you head over there, you have to study the traffic patterns that are going to be applicable to that particular airfield. And they're going to be based upon the type of aircraft that you're flying and what direction you're arriving from. And then you can also see some fairly deep turns that are asked of you when you're departing. So if you're taking off from 26, you're going to turn right about 45 degrees as soon as practicable to avoid noise over the small town of East Compton. That is one of the easier patterns to understand. And we'll show you examples of others. But once you get down there, it's a great airfield cafe. I have this little saying that tea, that's the hot stuff you drink that the Brits love so much, has saved general aviation in the United Kingdom, because the revenue from these wonderful little cafes that are at every single airport you go to help keep the economics of that airfield working, and they keep attracting pilots in droves all the time. And you can just see from this one photograph on a typical Saturday, the range of stuff that you're going to see coming and going when you're in one of these airfields is, it's like a flying museum, and they're all beautifully maintained. They also, though, do not have any prohibitions on non-aviation activities. So in the United States, the FAA has federal law that mandates that all utilization of the space inside of the perimeter fence of an airport must be in support of aviation activities. Well, they don't have that here. So what ends up happening is other industries, and in specifics, the automotive industry, will buy or rent space from that airfield. And as in this case, they're using it to store new cars before those cars go out into the distribution network, or they're being stored there over the winter season. And it's very easy for these other industries to price aviation out of the use of the airport. And eventually the airport will be destroyed economically by that. And that's quite difficult to see. Blackbush example, this is a PPR for them, so that's prior permission required. This is a very complex form. You got to supply all this kind of information before you can get permission to fly into that airport. So this whole business of prior permission required takes the spontaneity out of your flying. In other words, you can't just pop up into the air, tool along and decide, hey, let's drop down to that little island and get a crab roll. You know, you've got to have arranged these things ahead of time. The other issue here, Blackbush, is the traffic pattern and noise abatement briefing. This is the full set of pages you have to read through in detail and then come to an understanding with before you can successfully operate at this airfield. So if you're going to visit this airfield once, this is the learning curve that you have to go through to be able to do that. So here is a standard VFR join as diagrammed with noise sensitive areas marked out, and different points of entry and altitude requirements, and then the flight paths that you're supposed to fly relative to the runway. Yeah, that's a lot of work, okay? However, that's just the standard VFR join. It's going to change in terms of what the runway orientation and circuits are going to look like, depending upon whether it's good weather, which is this set of diagrams, or if the weather's bad, then it's going to look like this, which is sort of more like the traffic pattern you'd fly in a tail dragger anyway. This is traffic pattern where I fly at Goodwood. And so you can see there's some marked turns, such as departures from 2-4 right to avoid noise sensitive areas there as well, and different sizes depending upon what direction you're taking off or landing from. We do have an operating control tower. It's advisory only, as opposed to having a function of true control, but they do have a quasi role to support that sharing of information that increases situational awareness. In terms of instrument flight rules, you really have to go back a long way in the US general aviation history to find comparable circumstances. So first of all, they mandate 2 altimeters, as Bruce Landsberg has said, the vice chair of the NTSB, it's the most reliable thing in the airplane. Why do you need 2 of those? Most approaches are VOR or ADF, and they still mandate that you have to have an ADF receiver to fly IFR procedures. They're just now in 2021 starting to create regulations to relax that requirement. They do have ILSs, very few RNAVs, and most of those are just a clone of an ILS approach, but you have to have ADF as a backup. The radar services are very limited if there's no radar coverage because the tower is not staffed, which is typically kind of an 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. kind of thing, then you can't do instrument work at that airfield. And then the development of new instrument approaches has to be paid for by the individual airport. And that's a barrier to the growth of the instrument approach procedures, specifically holding back development of RNAV and GPS approaches. So when you get in an airplane in the UK, this is typically what you're going to see. There will be some G1000s. The flight schools at Goodwood's got G1000s, but most of the airplanes you're going to get in are going to look a lot like this, with a tablet augmenting with moving map information. And speaking of moving map, there are some good apps that are homegrown here in the UK that are specific to the sort of types of information you have to be able to work with here. in order to support your flying. You can also use Garmin Pilot, or you can use Pilot in combination with one of the local apps. Sky Demon is the preferred local app, and it has a handshake relationship with Garmin Pilot. So that allows you to share flight plans from planning in Sky Demon to execution in Pilot while you're in the air, and with a handoff to your panel mount kit if you have that, but very few people have that level of kit here. And then you can see the ability to get a NOTAM briefing, weather briefing, airport briefings, and so forth. You do have to read through most of these to find out what's happening about whether or not there's a tower is closed, and so it's going to revert to Class G during the daylight hours, or if there's military exercises or whatever. All of that has to be researched before you go flying. And then there's the units of measure. So the UK has obviously imperial units. So their gallon is different than our gallon, and liters different than quarts and pounds and kilograms. And so they use it all because there's a mix of vintage aircraft and contemporary aircraft, but you always buy fuel in liters. And so if you have a US POH for your aircraft and everything's in pounds, and you got to do all those conversions, on your own. So the things that they're missing, so there's no ADS-B, so you don't get any TSB or FSB. So forget about in-flight traffic and forget about in-flight weather. No in-flight weather available unless you're on a radio and you can reach somebody who might be able to help you. There's very limited coverage. We talked about that. Very weak flight following services. They're helpful, but believe me, I've used enough of them and been involved in enough airprox events here in the UK to know that the flight following is not strong. So I actually put a TCAS system in my 182. And there's no flight plan handoff between the app and the Civil Aviation Authority, air traffic controls, and then back to you. You can file a flight plan, which essentially nobody does. And they do have the hemispheric rule, but nobody follows that either. And I've been here 4.5 years and I haven't seen a single Cirrus airplane ever, anywhere. And I've been a lot of big airports that have big general aviation presence. Okay, so it's beautiful, absolutely beautiful. So this is what the countryside here looks like when you're up along the coastline. It's a lot of open farmland and rolling hills and medieval villages. Goodwood is used by Pilatus to do their test and development work for grass takeoff and landings, and they used it for the certification work on the new jet, which is a great bit of kit. This is a woman who flies at Goodwood, and believe it or not, so that's about a 1978 or 79 aircraft. She bought that when it was brand new and when she was much younger. And she flies that thing all the time and loves it. But you'll notice in her hands, this is exactly what most pilots are going to look like in the UK. They carry around big paper maps coated in plastic with, if you look very closely right here, 2 wax pencils, the kinds that you can peel the paper off of to extend more wax as you write out. They mark up all their charts the way we did 30 years ago. And that's how they fly. So yeah, and it works. Lots of old military stuff around of all different kinds of eras. So you can go to an airfield on any one day and see, half a dozen Spitfires and Hurricanes hanging out and playing in the sky. That's just a routine thing that happens here. At Goodwood, we've got vintage kit for the refueling that's been modernized in terms of the internal guts, but they've kept the aesthetic. And then at our show events, they bring out some of this old firefighting equipment as well, which is kind of fun. Speaking of old events, we have fly-ins where we bring aircraft in from all over the United Kingdom and Europe, and you'll see some amazing machines show up there, and people put on period garb and blend into the sort of atmosphere of what we have there. And they'll have docents who'll go around and talk to you about all the different aircraft that are there, and those will be people who have flown them. We have very large-scale events at Goodwood built around motor circuit racing, because there's a perimeter road around what used to be the airfield when it was a World War II fighter base. And that perimeter road has now been turned into a full-blown motor racing circuit that hosts many events throughout the entire year. Then this photograph I took at Farnborough. So you've heard of the Farnborough Air Show. So you can pop by there once a year as a civilian, or you can go in as I did through my industry work in aviation and get the cook's tour of the place. And it's amazing to see that kind of hardware in action in the air during the demo days. I've actually seen a C-130 perform a full loop at that show. Also at Goodwood, they put on a vintage week-long event called Revival. So their version of the Thunderbirds, the Red Arrows, shows up and does demos throughout the week. And then they've recreated these vintage storefronts where they'll stock them with products from the 1960s or 50s, and people will dress in period gear and come in vintage automobiles. Lots of vintage aircraft will arrive as part of that. I do fly outside of the UK as well. I did get down to the French Riviera and Monte Carlo and other places like that. So I rent a 172 and grab a local instructor and go out, have fun counting the mega yachts on the Mediterranean. It's much easier to fly in the rest of Europe, I find, than it is in some parts of the UK, just because, you know, they don't even have that PPR sort of requirement. So you can get a plane, take off, go where you want, drop in on places. It's a lot more spontaneous. Typical traffic picture for me with the TCAS system operational. There can be a lot of aircraft around, and not all the aircraft here, based on their age, will have radios as well. So whatever you have for traffic awareness, you're going to also have to keep your head on a swivel all the time. This is a Chipmunk that I had the pleasure of flying in, and we landed at this great little field where they have this donut shack set up on the field. And, you know, it's just very typical of what you'll find in the UK when you drop in on an airfield is something like this to help create a focal point for folks who are visiting. I did fly at Harvard, so the flight school at Goodwood has everything from a Piper Cub all the way up to this aircraft and a bunch of 172s. And so you can do your tail wheel checkout in the Cub and then transition to this T6 if you want to. It's a lower horsepower version of what we're used to in the US. And then we have one of the last 12 flying Messerschmitt Bf 109s in the world. And that thing makes a great sound. The sound's changed over the years because if you look carefully at the cowling, and then if you look at the Spitfires to the right, they've had to re-engine it with the same engine that's in the Spitfire because they weren't able to get any more parts to support the original engine that came with the aircraft. And then typical weather. So if you turn around, you can see this bright sunshine off on the left, and then there's clouds and rain on the right side here. You'll just learn to use your eyes as you're flying. And, you know, the best thing to do, as we do here, you take off, take a look. If you don't like what you see, come back down. But you don't have access to the weather data once you've launched. So you have to make all of your assessments ahead of time. And if the situation changes while you're flying, you know, you might just do a precautionary landing at another airfield nearby and finish the trip another time. So while I may have described many things that are challenging, I can also tell you it's an incredibly rich environment for general aviation. Everyone who's involved in it's very passionate. It supports all levels of flyers. Both in terms of skill, how much time they've had to do it, what their economic circumstances might be. It's kind of an all-comers community, and everybody gets to benefit from the encompassing approach toward all eras of aviation technology, all airborne at the same time. It's almost like living inside of a giant air show every day that you fly, and it's an amazing experience that way. So you chafe at the bit because you don't have the same technology to have access to, et cetera, et cetera. But in the end of the day, you slowly learn how to do it the old-fashioned way that we grew up doing, and then embrace this culture of diversity in the types of machines and people that you're going to fly with. This is the Silver Spitfire, which you've probably seen publicized. It was based out of Goodwood for the IWC Watch Company. And I know one of its stops was Bedford on its round the world flight. And it's a beautiful aircraft. So if you ever have a chance to come here, we'll go flying and you can see this aircraft and others like it that are all special examples of what the Brits do to preserve great aviation heritage as a flying workshop, not museums. Well, so that's my crash course, if you will, on flying in the UK. I appreciate you taking the time today to have a listen. And feel free, if you've got some questions, if you haven't already submitted those questions, please do. And then I'll try to answer them before we complete the program.
Paul, thank you very much for that. That's always fascinating information to find out about the UK. There are a couple of questions that popped up. The first one is, how much do you know how much it costs to get your private pilot's license in the UK?
Yeah, I'm gonna say roughly equivalent to 15 to 20,000 US. Yeah, it's a lot of money.
Yeah.
You can go up for one, session with a flight instructor to do some slow flights and stalls and a few takeoffs, and you pay about $700 when you get done with that. If you want to get recurrent in terms of IFR currency, just the fees for the approaches plus the landings, you're going to be at about $500 when you get done with that. Yeah, that's for the 6, et cetera. So yeah.
What about ForeFlight? Is it available in the UK?
Nobody that I know uses it. I believe they do have European, as they call it, databases. JEP has as well. So when you're feeding your tablet or your panel mounts, you can get databases to support this part of the world, obviously. But everybody here tends to use a homegrown app called Sky Demon. But you can use ForeFlight if you want to, yeah.
What about Cirrus aircraft? We saw a lot of beautiful vintage airplanes in your pictures, but are Cirrus aircraft common in the UK?
In 4.5 years of flying here, being based at 2 different major airports, one roughly the size of Hanscom Field, and one this great old military field called Goodwood, which probably has about 200 aircraft based here. 4.5 years of flying, I have never seen a Cirrus once anywhere at any airfield or even flying overhead. The Diamond products do have a popularity here, the twin and also the singles. Yeah, the variety of aircraft that you'll find here is vast, but there's a massive vacuum of Cirrus product that I just haven't seen it anywhere. Part of the reason is the grass and the runway lengths. They're really not that good at, you're not going to get a Cirrus comfortably in and out of a 1,500-foot grass strip that's carrying a little water from dew or the rest of that stuff. So, yeah, so I think part of the reason that they're not common here, and there is so much grass to work with all the time here. It's a routine part of how you fly.
Paul, a couple more questions have come in. What happens if you have to land somewhere due to weather and haven't completed a PPR request?
Yeah, no PPR. If there's weather, then they open the doors. There's no fees or charges for anything you have to do that might be driven by precautionary landing that's driven by weather. And flying here, I have made one precautionary landing that was forced upon me by weather, and welcomed with open arms and the courtesy car and that kind of stuff. Yeah, that was great. And I will add, in terms of instrument approaches, now try to figure this out. You have to pay for all practice approaches, whether you go missed or not. If you go missed, you pay a second time when you come back in. You pay for touch and goes, etc. Okay, that discourages 2 things. It discourages staying current or practicing sufficiently to be really competent, and it discourages people from honoring minimums. However, if you're using instrument approaches in real IR weather, then they'll waive the approach fees. Yeah, as long as the tower is staffed. You cannot make an instrument approach in this country unless there's an operating control tower with radar coverage. And that's quite different than what we're used to in the States.
Well, one of our new members has asked, do you know if gliders need to also get all the prior permissions to land? When going cross country, you may not know where you're planning to land in a glider.
Yeah, I have no idea.
Okay.
Obviously, gliders are going to end up landing places they didn't intend to. So far, from what I've seen of the glider operations that are here, there's a couple of things that are noteworthy. One, they don't always have to carry what's called electronic conspicuousness devices, so transponder or ADS-B or some other thing. There's half a dozen different sort of budget approaches toward generating traffic data for other users. And with half a dozen different schemes out there, if somebody's gone for the $200 option, as opposed to like a $5,000, Garmin 330 ES ADS-B transponder. Only people who are on that same platform will see that particular aircraft. So the glider community here does have a specific electronic conspicuously device that they use, and the glider port will receive that data and send it back out to airplanes that use that same gadget. There is one striking difference here with ADS-B is if you want to self-equip with ADS-B here, they allow people to do that with essentially a portable device, and I'm talking about a transceiver that transmits ADS-B data using a non-certified GPS position source. So it's a lot lighter touch regulatory wise for ADS-B implementation if you want to do that. And they do have a rebate program. They're trying to get people to equip so that their aircraft can have better visibility electronically in the air. And they are encouraging people to move in the ADS-B direction, but no regulatory mandate for that yet.
One of our directors has asked, do most pilots native to the UK fly from the right seat as drivers do?
No, yeah, they don't. And to be honest with you, if you look at this picture here, a hell of a lot of aircraft in the UK are tandem. So there's no right seat, left seat. There's center seat,
Yeah.
Yeah, but no, their layout is pilot on the left for fixed wing, pilot on the right for rotary wing. Same as we have, let's keep in mind the Wright brothers set the precedence, and the Curtiss and all the rest of it, Douglas and Boeing, and run the list. So
one of our directors has talked about, has asked rather, what about turbine aircraft and wanting to fly IFR? Is that very different compared to the USA with PPRs that you noted?
yeah, it is very different. So I have a friend that flies turbine-powered aircraft here in the UK, and he described a scenario where when you're on the ground, you'll plan one IFR flight. When you get your clearance, you'll get a different IFR flight plan than it had anything to do with what you planned. Then when you leave the surface of the ground and transition to departure control, you'll get a third IFR flight plan that has nothing to do with the first two. And then when you end up on en route, they'll give you a fourth IFR flight plan that has nothing to do with the first three. And that is a frustrating experience for a lot of flyers who have to operate heavy iron here. Yeah, they're very protective of aircraft serving the airlines and the space available. So their Class A airspace near me starts at 5,000 or 6,000 feet. And that's kind of a drag. There isn't a lot of high terrain here, so that's less of an issue. They used to have an ability to fly IFR in uncontrolled airspace without any flight plan or permissions, but they've done away with that.
So airliners wouldn't have to have all these changing flight plans?
Probably not. In fact, I know they don't. There will be changes that are made based on what we learned during our visit to Heathrow that are going to be driven by a couple of things. So one of the big factors that drives what they'll do with an aircraft when it's leaving Heathrow is they'll assess how proficient the crew is based upon the performance of crews in that same airline. And they're going to look at language proficiency as well as the general history that that airline has with the air traffic controllers out of Heathrow. And that will change how they route the aircraft out of Heathrow into the connecting airspace and air corridors that they're going to use for outbound traffic. They're also limited in how much noise they're allowed to drop onto the surface by aircraft leaving Heathrow. So they will apportion so many to the north, so many to the south to try and spread that load out. So there will be changes that the airliners have to cope with when they push back, and it will start from a time before the pushback happens that the airline crew may not be aware of, but they're making decisions for the airliner based on past performance of other flight crews for the same airline.
Paul, our new director and fellow airport guy had a question that I also was thinking. Why so many turf runways?
Well, a lot of these airports that are turf-based are leftovers from World War II. And back in the day, if you're flying, hurricanes and mosquitoes and Spitfires and things like that, you didn't need paved runways. In fact, the origin of these airfields, if you go far but enough back in time, was a large contiguous circle of grass, so that you could taxi around the perimeter of the circle and point the aircraft into the wind, no matter what direction the wind was blowing in. And likewise when you were landing. But then as runway length requirements increased, it became necessary to extend beyond, and eventually it evolved into what we see now. It's also cheaper, and they have a weather system here that's, in terms of the climate, that supports healthy turf year round. There's no snow or ice to deal with. Nothing ever has to be plowed. The coldest weather you'll typically encounter is about freezing, and that won't last for very long. By noontime, it's going to be in the 50s, and the hottest weather you'll see might be in the low 80s, but typically it'll never get beyond about the mid 70s. And then there's a lot of private airfields, and those are typically grass because they don't cost very much to equip or maintain compared to tarmac.
Paul, thank you very much. That is always a great lesson to learn about the UK and flying. That's all we have for questions, and I'm going to hand it off to David.
And thank you very much, Keith, and thank you, Paul, for that amazing presentation. It was very interesting to see how flying differed there, and it's also some of the beautiful pictures and aircraft, and to learn about the aviation community in England.
Yeah, and David, let me mention one quick topic for you. If you fly over here, you need to have about 6 million British pounds worth of insurance for the harm you may do to others using your airplane. So think about the underwriting requirements for that.
That's true. That's a good point, because from time to time we have clients that bring their aircraft over to England or other places in Europe, and they have to comply with the EU requirements, which I think are still similar in England now, and very high liability limits, which is adds cost. Fortunately, the cost for liability is a little bit less expensive in Europe than it is here, because the society there's a little bit less litigious, so lawsuits are a little bit less common, but ironically they require higher liability limits, so that's another challenge. But that was fascinating, and I think we all certainly appreciate the freedoms we have here. So thank you very much, Paul. And also want to thank Keith, our secretary, for moderating the presentation tonight. As always, Keith did an outstanding job of that as our resident Zoom expert. And then I'd like to also thank all our membership for attending tonight. And I want everyone to know my door is always open if anyone has ideas on how to improve our club and better serve our membership. As Georgia mentioned, in-person events will resume soon. Later this spring, we'll schedule some flyouts to some airports that have some good outdoor seating and some great restaurants. And then in the meantime, we'll be holding another virtual seminar on May 12th via Zoom, in which Peter Smith, the co-founder and chief operating officer of Transcend Air, will be talking about his company's development of a vertical takeoff and lift aircraft that will be used for air taxi operations. And then in June, date to be determined, a TBM owner, Jim Baum, will be talking about his adventures around the world in his aircraft. He has some great pictures and adventures to talk about in his TBM. So with that, I hope you all have a wonderful evening. Thanks again for attending. Good night and happy flying.